Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great and actually an emotional moment to be at the Lennart Meri conference. It's 10th anniversary, and the last edition with Thomas Silves. So I'm very grateful to be here. Today's this panel is titled Europe Whole and Free, a Fading Dream, ? And when I read that title, for some reason, I thought about Alice in Wonderland and the disappearing cat. And I wanted to remind you of one scene of Alice with the cat. She comes across the cat who's sitting on a tree, and she says to the cat, which road should I take? And the cat says, well, that depends a great deal on where you want to go. And Alice says, I don't know. And the cat says, well, it doesn't matter then, does it? As we look at Europe's Cheshire cat problem, the disappearing act, is it not so much that Europe doesn't know where it's going as the fact that is it not so much the fact that it doesn't know where it's going, Europe, that matters more than the question of is Europe disappearing, is the European project disappearing altogether? We have a great panel to help us explore all this. I'll start with Riina, Kionka, who is the main policy advisor of the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who has an extensive experience with European affairs, foreign affairs, questions related to Europe, and also human rights, which I think matters also in terms of Europe's future. I'm moving towards myself, we have Radek Sikorski, Foreign Minister of Poland from 2007 to 2014, a big leader and actor in European affairs during that period. You were then President of the Parliament, the same, and you are now a fellow, a senior fellow at Harvard University. We have Andrey Kortunov, who is from the Russian International Affairs Council, a think tank in Moscow. And Andrey, I asked Andrey before we all came here, and I said, Andrey, people may be wondering, is the Russian International Affairs Council independent? And he said, yes, we are, and we are also working with the Russian government. So I keep the adjective independent as the first description. And then we have Andrey Krastev, who is with Ivan Krastev.
You can go.
I'm a great fan of Ivan, so this is a slip of the tongue, and who is the director of the Center for Liberal Studies based in Sofia, and who's a great commentator and analyst of European questions. He recently published an article in the New York Times, one of many great articles. The title was, America isn't going crazy, it's just becoming more like Europe. Looking at America's presidential campaign, of course. What we're going to do is I'm going to launch the panelists. I'd like to start with Andrey, because I think it's interesting and important to have a voice from Moscow on these issues, and then we will dwell on perhaps more internal European questions. And so we have until 5:45. I've been giving a little bit more time because we're starting late. And I hope to have a flowing conversation. Please feel free to interact among each other. And quite quickly, I'd like to bring in questions from the audience as well to keep this as a dialogue. Andrey, you wrote recently, much has been said so far since yesterday about how tense the situation is between Europe and Russia. And there's many comments have been made about Russia's behavior. But you also wrote recently, I believe it was last year, actually. Sooner or later, all crises come to an end, and life goes on. And I guess my question is, do you see, we're talking about Europe whole and free. In the very early 90s, after the Cold War had ended, there was a hope that somehow Russia could be part of that sense of Europe whole and free. Andrey Kozyrev was recently in a conference in Washington. I watched the podcast, and he reminded everybody that at that time, in 91, 92, there were still discussions going on about what kind of relationship NATO and Russia might have. But certainly, the point was that there was a hope that Russia and Europe could be part of something common or sharing some essential values. Is this right now in a complete deadlock? And how do you react, coming from Moscow, to the notion of Europe whole and free?
Well, thank you, Natalie. First of all, I'm really grateful for having a chance to be here and to participate in this very open-minded and very thought-provoking event. Since I am the only one on this panel who has a privilege or a misfortune to represent a non-EU country, I think that I can have a kind of look from a certain perspective. It doesn't mean that I'm not biased. I am in my own way, but I'm biased probably differently compared to insiders. Let me start with saying that if I were to assess the current state of the European Union, I would probably compare it to a midlife crisis. Because when you are young, you are ambitious, you are full of energy, but at the same time you are naive, and probably sometimes you over-exaggerate your capacities. Sky is the limit. And then, at some point, you start to realize that you have assets, but you also have liabilities, and you have certain limitations. And I think the wisdom of the middle age crisis, which is too important to be wasted, is to assess correctly your comparative advantages, your strengths. So today we hear many discussions in the European Union about where to move from here. And many people say that indeed the European Union has to do something about the decision-making process. It has to do something about hard power. And I don't want to question these ideas, but I think that these ideas sometimes fail to come to somehow include the uniqueness of the European project. Because if you compare the European Union to other major players in the global politics, I think it would be very difficult for the European Union to compete with Russia or with China or even with the United States, for example, in decision-making process. The decision-making process here is likely to be protracted, ambiguous, cumbersome. It is also hard to imagine that the European Union can become an independent supplier of hard power. I think the most important thing, not just for you, but for us, for the outsiders, is that the European Union happens to be the rule setter, the institution which defines standards and norms in the international relations. And this is what other players are looking for. As far as Russia is concerned, let me say that in my view, Russia can survive without the European Union. If oil prices go high, it might even prosper without the European Union, but I don't think that Russia can have a successful modernization project without a very close cooperation with the Union, for a number of reasons. First of all, this shift to Asia demonstrated that it takes time to build a kind of relationship that we still have with the European Union. In terms of the normative base, in terms of the thickness of penetration, in terms of the Russian diasporas in Europe, in many ways. So Asia, in order to move in this direction and to achieve the same results in Asia, it will take probably another quarter of a century. And I don't frankly think that Russia has this time. Second, I do believe that Europe, the European Union, is much more interested in a true modernization of Russia than Asia. Again, for a variety of reasons. I think that Asia is interested definitely in Russian resources, in commodities, in the Russian energy, but I don't see there a genuine interest in unleashing the potential of the Russian society. I think for a number of reasons, Europe can benefit more from this than our partners and friends in the East. And finally, probably the most important, I do believe that if we have a global order, it will be based on European principles, not on any other principles. And from this viewpoint, I'd like to defend my old friend Frank Fukuyama. I think he is right. Not in the sense that the history is ended, but in the sense that there is only one order, a liberal order, which might prevent the world from falling apart. So I think that indeed we failed, and we have to confess it, that we turned out to be too naive and too romantic about Russia joining Europe. Now we have to pay a price for our, I would say, light approach to this relationship. We lost our battle. I hope that we didn't lose the war, and it will probably take another decade or 2 decades. The only question is how much we are likely to pay in terms of time, in terms of blood and treasure, for getting back to where we belong.
Okay, many things to reflect on. Radek, I'd like to bring you in, if you will, on perhaps before touching upon the question of Russia, but the question that we're looking at, Europe whole and free, a fading dream. Is it a fading dream?
Well, unfortunately, it now looks as if the attempt to pass a constitution for Europe was the high point of European idealism, and perhaps the beginning also of what we now see, which is people voting in referenda on not on what is the subject of the referendum, but on other trivial issues. And the way I see the crisis in Europe is that it's essentially a crisis of governability. What the Euro crisis and Schengen crisis have in common is that they are both confederal arrangements in which the system provides great benefits for its members, but it is up to the members to enforce the rules. And when the rules are broken, it only takes one member, and it's in both cases the same member, to bring the whole thing crashing down. So in terms of institutional development, Europe is, like the United States, under Articles of Confederation. There are Americans in the audience who can no doubt correct me, but I understand that the War of Independence was fought under them, and it meant that George Washington was commanding the army, but the supply of troops and of provisions was up to the states, which meant that very often the Continental Army went hungry and had no provisions, which is why George Washington became a strong supporter of creating a federal government with tax-raising powers. And this is where we are in Europe. Leaders know this, that as has been hinted, decisions are very difficult to arrive at. It's very difficult to run the thing. We try to do it through peer review, through all kinds of arrangements that are then seen as undemocratic because they've not been approved by the people of Europe. But the result is that we are neither fully democratic nor fully functional. And I would just say that if either the British leave or the Americans elect Donald Trump with the isolationism that will imply, Europe has to look at this again because times are becoming much more dangerous, and we will not be pulling our weight in world affairs with this dysfunctional a system.
Thank you. Riina, I'd like to come to you. We've heard two comments. One is, we've failed. We've heard that sentence. And then Radek saying, it's a problem of governance in Europe. You work from within the institutions. If something is fading, if the dream is fading, is it essentially a problem of governance?
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to the organizers also for inviting me. And I should note, as I always do on these panels, that I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and so nothing I say should be used against my boss. Is the dream fading? I think the dream of a utopian federalist Europe is fading indeed, but it's useful to remember that that wasn't everybody's dream, and for some it was a nightmare. So it may not be a bad thing that we need to adjust our expectations in this regard. President Ilves set the tone last night with his speech, comparing and contrasting this Lennart Meri conference or the situation with what happened, what was going on in the world in 2007 when the things started. It's true that we're facing many crises at the same time. We feel this certainly within the European Council. We've had, in the first half of the mandate of President Tusk, we've had 15 European Councils, which is more than was foreseen in the treaties, certainly. But it's because we have these 5 crises simultaneously. So we have the refugee crisis, we have the terrorism crisis, and unfortunately there's been a populist-inspired melange between the two to arrive at a perverse kind of formula whereby a refugee or migrant is taken in many places by many politicians these days as a potential terrorist, which is not the case, obviously. We have the crisis of Russian aggression. We have the Greece crisis and the prospect of a Brexit. So 5 crises all at the same time. Each of them, taken by itself, has the potential to tear apart the Union. And if you put them all together, then we are facing a kind of existential situation. So as my boss likes to say, the situation is dramatic. But as Churchill said, we should never let a good crisis go to waste. And this is a time for looking at what we can do to change the situation. There's no silver bullet. I have to disappoint you. I don't have any magic cures. But I do think it's useful to bear in mind a few postulates as we sift through possibilities. The first is that the EU is not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. The EU is a problem-solving machine. It's like you put the problems in, it's like a sausage machine. You put the problems in, and then you crank and crank and crank, and out comes the solution. And the solution is not necessarily to everybody's taste, but it has an element of something for everybody. So this is useful to keep in mind when we look at these crises. The European Union has gone through crises before. There's a whole list of them. I won't go through them. But we've muddled through, and I feel certain that we'll muddle through this time as well. We talked about the fading dream, the fading utopian dream. I think what this means is that we need to adjust expectations and possibly adjust some technicalities. This has been tried along the way through adjustments to the treaty in different ways of making decisions in QMV and other institutional changes that have come about. And we already have some variable geometry in the EU. Somebody mentioned this last night. We have the Eurozone, we have the Schengen zone. Not everybody belongs to all of those. So technicalities are important, but they're not enough. And what we need is really a political transformation to protect the principles of liberal democracy. What that depends on is 2 things. First of all, the quality of leadership. There was a lot of talk yesterday and this morning about leadership. We talked yesterday, I think Steve Erlanger noted that Chancellor Merkel has been weakened. And we have elections coming up in Germany and in France, in a few weeks in Spain, to say nothing of possible flash snap elections in the UK after depending on what happens on the 23rd. So whatever solution comes out of all of these elections and these political processes, I think the important thing is that what we get at the end of it is the stamina to withstand populism, which is, according to one of the recent Politico polls, is seen as the single most difficult problem facing the EU among Brussels insiders. It depends on the quality of leadership, but what a political transformation also depends upon is the will to act together. Now, yesterday, Frans Timmermans spoke of he used the counterfactual argument for the UK. The UK will be facing X, Y, and Z problem anyway, but is it better to do that within the EU or without? But it's the question that should be posed also regarding the EU itself. we would be facing an aggressive Russia anyway. We would be facing a refugee crisis anyway. We would be facing terrorism anyway. But is it better to do that together, face them together, and figure it out, or alone? That's the real question. Now, finally, I think that what we need to do is rekindle, recapture a belief in ourselves, a belief in Europe itself. It's striking in my job. I have the privilege of taking part in a number of, all the meetings that my boss has with foreign leaders. And one thing is the public message that comes out of the press points, but another is what they say behind the table. And it doesn't matter whether it's Prime Minister Modi, whether it's Prime Minister Abe, whether it's President Jokowi of Indonesia, they all say one and the same thing. They're all passionate, fervent believers in Europe, in the power, the transformative power of Europe, and in Europe as an entity and as a problem-solving machine. And it's striking because we have forgotten that in Europe itself. I think the most poignant reminder came recently from President Obama in Hanover when he, in a speech titled very appropriately, "To the People of Europe," he reminded us that the world and the US needs a strong, prosperous, and united Europe. And in fact, he made a point of saying that maybe you need an outsider to come and tell you this, to remind you of the magnitude of what you have achieved here in Europe. So why do we need for President Obama to remind ourselves of this? Why have we lost this belief? I mean, I don't have an answer to the question, but I do think it's something to keep in mind as we look for answers. And I think I'd just end with that sometimes the view is clearer from the outside, but we do need to believe in Europe itself as well. Thank you.
Ivan, Riina has just spoken about the doubts and the questions surrounding the question of defending, protecting liberal democracy. And your center is called the Center for Liberal Strategies. We need liberal strategies in Europe. What are your thoughts on whether that dream or reality of liberal democracy is fading in Europe?
Let's make 2 points on dream. First of all, when somebody has a sleepless night, he does not dream much. So from this point of view, this is the first thing that has changed. But seriously speaking, I do believe that there is one particularity of this crisis which would be taken much more serious. This is not that we basically start to hate the world that is coming to us and somebody else created. The problem is that both American and European voters started very much to resent this very world that we created. For example, this was world about open borders. Everything that we have been dreaming about yesterday is the same thing that basically keeps you sleepless today. Free trade. Is there any major American presidential candidate who is for free trades these days? No. Open borders. Before, we believed that open borders is going very much to undermine authoritarian governments. Now, after the refugee crisis, we have the feeling that open borders are going much more to undermine liberal democracies. And this is creating, in my view, one of the problems of the European crisis. We don't have a language. We cannot say that open borders is simply good because the voters does not share this anymore in this crisis. At the moment when we say that open borders is a source of insecurity, then the very idea of the European Union, which is based on the idea of beneficial interdependence, is going to be totally undermined. And this is why I do believe part of the problem with the European Union is not that people does not know what to do, but they don't have a language on which to justify their policies. And this is, in my view, the biggest problem with part of even the liberal democracy story. The second, and this is very much connected to the foreign policy issue. Listen, the elites are losing their control over foreign policy. Full stop. Here we have an interesting conversation. From time to time, I have the feeling that we talk as if we do not watch television in our own countries and how the debate goes on there. And I do believe President Ilves is basically very much touched to this. I'm living now in Austria. They're going to elect in a week the far-right president. I'm Bulgarian, so about messiness I have certain expertise that cannot be questioned. And from this point of view, I'm saying that in a certain way, it's not that the dream is simply fading, but for many people, the same thing that was dream yesterday is becoming a nightmare today. And this is why it's so difficult to react. And here is, in my view, the major difference between European Union and Russia or China or the United States. In these isolationist moments, of course, everybody is going to pay certain cost of being isolationist, But neither the United States is going to collapse because of it, neither China nor Russia being a classical nation states. For the European Union, we cannot afford to do this, simply because at the moment when we get isolationists, if we believe that interdependence is a source of insecurity, then why do you stay together? And I'm saying this because, and I want to make one last point, which is very much related to something which Radek said. Everybody knows what is going to go wrong if Britain decides to get out. By the way, psychologically, this is going to send a very bad signal to everybody. Nevertheless, do people like or dislike UK in the European Union? This is going to be a very strong signal. And this strong signal, by the way, is going to be very much, in my view, felt in Central and Eastern Europe. There is one difference between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe when it comes to disintegration. We have a personal experience of this. All of us have seen a system that looks quite stable that collapsed overnight. I'm Bulgarian. Listen, I was sure I was 25 in 1989. I was sure that we are going to retire there. It was as stable as nature in Bulgaria. Bulgaria was not Poland. So from this point of view, people in Eastern Europe has the experience of people that have lost their money on a bank run. So when the next crisis started, we have the tendency to overestimate the nature of the crisis. And nevertheless, that Eastern Europe is very much pro-European for very objective reasons than many of West Europeans. Western Europe believes much more in the resilience of the Union than we do. And I'm afraid that many East European governments will start to hedge against the EU, not simply because of the populist nature of some of their governments, but exactly because of this experience, which is something that is shaping people. And this is a risk factor which, in my view, is not taken seriously when we're discussing some of the risks. I'm saying this because if Britain decides to stay, this is going to be a very important psychological moment for the European unity, but then can come the feeling that now everybody should go for a referendum to show and to legitimize the European Union. And as somebody who has been studying Soviet and Yugoslav collapse, believe me, the idea that you can save political project like European Union through referendums in different countries all the time, this is to believe that you can give a revolver to somebody who had a suicide instincts and you're going to save him.
Okay, lots of stuff here. I wanted to first share with you some. I dug up some statistics from the Eurobarometer study, you know, that takes the pulse of public opinion in European countries, and it's a fairly recent statistic, and it shows that things are not going great, but they aren't completely. You know, the dream is not completely faded. The question was, do you have a positive image of the EU? And 37% of people polled in European EU member states, 37% said they did have a positive image of the EU. Asked whether they had a neutral image of the EU, 38% said that was the case. And those who said they had a negative image of the EU are 23%. So there are fewer people who have a negative image of the EU than people who have a positive image of the EU, despite all of the events and crises we've seen. What's key is that the center ground are neutral. A lot of people just don't know what they think about it. And I think if we try to move on to what needs to be done, we've been in the diagnosis of the situation. What needs to be done, I think it really is about addressing those that big chunk of people who are in the middle, who just don't know. So does any one of you want to come in on how do you convince people? How do you revive that dream? What needs to be done? I mean, it's easy to talk among ourselves, experts, analysts, policymakers, think tankers, but in the end, you know, the voters are the ones where these doubts are seeping in. What needs to be done? Radek, would you like to come in?
I think we need to change the terms of discourse in Europe, because the way it's worked for the last few decades is that national politicians, who of course have to compete for votes, so they stress the national interest when they go to Brussels. Then they make sensible deals in Brussels and come back and also argue that they defended the national interest above all. And nobody speaks for Europe as a whole, because the European Commission regards itself as more of a civil service to the Council rather than a government. And you don't have a body you don't hear the arguments. Let me give you an example. I lived in Britain in the 1980s, in the 90s, and I'm following the Brexit debate. It is only now, during the Brexit debate, and if it's won, it will have been a useful exercise, that you are learning in Britain,
if it's won comfortably,
the basic facts about how the EU works. For decades, the British public was fed by populist press with the notion that Brussels decides these directions and they are imposed on the hapless British people. Well, that's not how it works, and they're only learning it now. It might be too late. But what I'm saying is that, at the very least, the Commission's office in all the member states should be much more active in explaining to the media, to the public, when the national politicians won't do it, how the EU works. And also, the national politicians can no longer can no longer count on the fact that the consensus for Europe will take care of itself, because your numbers show how fragile it is. And they realize, mostly, how badly off we would be if Europe collapsed. Well, they need to say it much more openly. They need to take risks, and they need to show leadership much more than hitherto.
Leadership. Ivan, would you like to comment on whether there is leadership?
Yeah, I'll try. First of all, I'll be very skeptical about reading polls kind of too actively in a period like this. In March 1991, there was a referendum in many parts of the Soviet Union, not in the Baltic states, where almost 70% of those who voted for the Soviet Union to remain. So from this point of view, it was even stronger than an opinion poll, and then I don't believe it helped them much. So from this point of view, in my view, it's very important. Machiavelli used to say that in politics there are good times and bad times. And the only thing you can hope for during the bad times is that you accumulated enough support and loyalty on the side of the people in order to survive the bad times. I don't believe that for the European Union, and I know that this is going to be very kind of unfashionable what I say, I don't believe that this is the moment in which we should go back to the dream talk. Because part of the problem in the European Union is much more the crisis of democracy on the level of the nation state, and not simply the problem with the European institutions. And when you basically start to go highly idealistic, when people are totally confused, you can lose a lot. So from my point of view, the most important for the next 2 or 3 years is to survive, not allowing to destroy the integrity of the institution and basically the governmental system that was created. Because otherwise, we can basically decide to do things that otherwise makes a lot of sense from the point of view of value talk. But there is nothing which is exposing weakness more than somebody who wants to show strength that it does not work. I'm saying this because you remember, even when the Russian aggression in Ukraine started, many people said it's bad, but on the other side it's good because it's an external threat and this is going to consolidate European Union. It did not. It did not. No. We keep the sanctions and so on, but it did not for many important reasons. One of them, it was discussed on the previous panel. Russia is not the Soviet Union, but also because the threat perceptions of the South and the North have been very different. They're much more scared about refugees and what is coming from Libya than what is coming from Russia. I'm saying this because there cannot be a silver bullet which can guarantee the European Union coming from outside. We should simply survive this period, and we should survive keeping a level of unity, level of governability, but also the nature of our political regimes. Because one thing that I'm much more afraid than kind of the rise of a total anti-European parties and others is that normally if European Union is going to collapse, and I hope it's not going to happen, this is going to have the structure of a bank run. Some governments starts to fear that there is no enough liquidity in the bank, and then start hedging. They start to have policies to prepare themselves if the things go wrong. And then when one government starts to do it, another government starts to do it. For example, there was a referendum in the Netherlands on a totally artificial talk about the Ukrainian associations. And then another country decides that they're going to have a referendum on the refugees. And then third is going to have a referendum on something else. And we're going to end up with the situation where everybody is blocking somebody, and nothing works. So from this point of view, probably trying to trivialize some of the problem, buying time, is going to be important. And this is also leadership, because in the time of crisis, the leadership is also to try to avoid type of missteps that can put the whole project, in my view, in danger.
Okay, I'm going to open up shortly to questions in the audience, so start preparing your questions. But before that, I'd like to come back to something that Riina mentioned, which is the American message towards Europe. I mean, Europe whole and free. This is a conference with a strong transatlantic dimension, and Europe whole and free has very much been a project, an American project, since the Second World War. And we've seen speeches given by the U.S. president in Europe, in London, to try to prevent Brexit, which many of you have mentioned, and to try to consolidate the very notion of togetherness in Europe, and that Europe has things to be, a kind of morale-boosting speech. That was the purpose of the Hanover speech, it seems. But there's also another aspect, which is that there are big question marks as to whether this U.S. commitment to that project of Europe whole and free is still really there, or will continue to be there if it still really is there. You know, the question marks hanging over that do feed into what's going on, and they're being watched from Moscow, and they're being watched from elsewhere. And I think, this is my personal opinion, but I think that the way Europe has been hit by the crises and the war in Syria and is also connected, obviously, to U.S. choices. And it could be said, I mean, I would defend that proposition. It could be said that I think the U.S. has let Syria happen to Europe, basically, both in terms of refugee flows, incredible numbers of people, over nearly 1.3 million people asked for asylum in Europe last year. Of course, it's only slightly over 0.2% of the population of the EU. It should have been managed. But still, this amazing, dramatic thing that the Syria war has had a direct impact on Europe, and Europeans have not really had a say on how that would be managed. It was all managed by the US. So my question is, does it matter that the US remains committed? Do you think the US will remain committed? And does the US role in Europe play a decisive part in that dream of your whole and free? And counterintuitively, I'd like to bring in Andrey Kortunov on this, because from Moscow's, and I'm sure the positions are going to be contrasted, but seen from Moscow, what is the importance of the U.S. role if you agree that a Europe whole and free is the dream?
Well, should you or should I?
Yeah. To you.
Well, you know, first of all, let me say that, and I have to be very candid here. When you talk about Europe, free and united, many in Moscow would argue that it's not Russia which is deviating from the European dream, but it is Europe which is doing that. And that Russia remains the inheritor and the guardian of the true European values. The values which existed in Europe for centuries, and the values which made Europe great.
Could you care to define, just in 2 words, those values? That we
well,
understand?
again, you know, first of all, I don't want you to have an impression that I share this view. Okay. But the point is that, you know, Europe became great because the European civilization was based on a deep religious feeling, on traditional family values, on strong community feeling, on nationalism. And that's what made Europe Europe. That's what left the cultural heritage that we all enjoy right now. Allegedly, Europe, since the end of the Cold War, or maybe earlier, started to gradually deviate from these values, tilting towards multiculturalism, towards excessive consumerism, towards excessive secularism, things like that. So if you look at the situation from the Kremlin, they would tell you that Europe is betraying its own ideas. So having said that, let me get to the question of the United States and Europe. I think that whatever might be stated in Moscow about the perils of the US engagement in Europe, I think that realistically, many believe that the United States should maintain its presence in Europe. And one of the most characteristic examples of that would be the Ukrainian crisis. I had a chance to talk to many decision makers in Moscow, and I think that the predominant view right now is that the keys to the solution of the Ukrainian crisis, at least to the implementation of the Minsk agreements, lies not in Brussels, not in Paris, not in Berlin, but in Washington, D.C. And that unless the United States is engaged in a more active way, there will be no progress in the implementation of the Minsk agreements. So this is a kind of, I would say, typical Russian schizophrenia on the US role in Europe, and not only in Europe, that can be applied to Middle East as well, in my view.
Would anyone else like to comment on the US role?
Yeah, well, I think Europe whole and free remains an American preference, but it's no longer a priority, and it started much earlier. I was in Poland and then in the United States in 2001, and you could see from one month to the next the change of priorities of the Bush administration. Early George Bush Jr. wanted to engage in Latin America and to complete Europe whole and free. 9/11 changed on that, all that, and the United States went on this tangent of war on terrorism, and these two policies became victims of the Iraq War and everything that followed.
Mm-hmm.
I also just want to continue because it's enough. We all have read the Atlantic article, interview with President Obama, and probably I'm sure that there is an interest, support for the project, but simply Europe is not as important as it was. And I don't believe this is going to change even with the change of the president. I was thinking, by the way, who is going to be the East European, who is going to have any type of influence on one of the possible presidents, and probably only Mrs. Trump is the one coming from the region that basically is doing this. No, I'm saying this because I do believe this is a long-term trend, and we should not kind of cheat ourselves how easy it will be for America to orient, because it's the result of demography, it's the result of the economy, it's the result of the geopolitical resettling. So we should take this fact. And by the way, I do believe it's very important also when American officials talk to us, basically to make this clear instead of saying, listen, but we are very much committed. Not if you read what the president is saying, and probably what the next president is saying. But there is also interesting something on the European side. There was last month published the results of the Bertelsmann study of public opinion in Germany concerning Russia and the Ukrainian crisis. And you can see something, first of all, German public opinion, contrary to the beliefs of many in Eastern Europe, is not pro-Russia and pro-Putin at all. But the raising security concerns about Russia is not translated into pro-Americanism like it was in the Cold War. Mm. And from this point of view, it's not simply that Russia cannot bring Europe together, it's also not bringing Europe and the United States together. And I do believe this is a reality. This has generational explanations. You can see a very major generational differences when it comes to the United States. And probably this is something that also we should discuss and not pretend that it is not there.
Okay, I'm going to take a round of questions. I believe you are the president of Estonia. You would like to ask a question. Is there a microphone? And then move that way. Are there any other hands, just to get an idea? Okay.
Yeah, Thomas, it was less of a question, but I think that when we talk about the crisis in Europe and the crisis in values, I think we forget that actually Europe is not Christian and all of that. It is a child of the Enlightenment. What unites the United States with Europe ultimately is John Locke. It is Montesquieu and the division of powers and limitations on executive authority, the role of the legislative branch, and the role of the courts in deciding whether these things are right. Now, when I see what's happening in Europe is this, first of all, with the rise of populism, this demand of overriding referenda, which have little to do with rule of law or constitutionalism. We see a degree of populism on the one hand and a degree of, some places, rising authoritarianism, which all is a betrayal of the Enlightenment tradition. I mean, basically, what happened after the war was an institutionalization of the Enlightenment that was present here and there, and certainly in the UK before the war, but absent in many countries, including some of the old Europeans, as I might add. And so what we're looking, I mean, for me, a lot of what I see is not a problem with the European Union, but rather a failure to really embed the values of the Enlightenment and going for cheap shots, you know. I mean, everything from, you know, demanding a referendum on gay rights to, well, to all kinds of other things that are worse than that. But the point is that it's forgetting what are the fundamental values, and those are not, I mean, those came out of France and Scotland, frankly, in the 18th century. And before that, we were as backward as any other place.
Thank you for mentioning Montesquieu. I hope my country, France, is going to remember that the Enlightenment had a lot to do with its philosophers and thinkers, especially next year in the presidential election. I think that's a key point, and I must say that in an earlier debate here, I heard something that I didn't think I would hear at the Lennart-Meri conference. I had the honor of meeting Lennart-Meri years ago, and he was an enlightenment, a figure of enlightenment in Europe. And one comment I heard from the audience was that migrants are a threat to European culture. I didn't think I would hear that here, and for me, it's a symptom of how some discourses are creeping into circles where you might think you wouldn't find them. You might think you wouldn't find them. So, you know, Frans Timmermans said very powerfully that our nations will not disappear under the pressure of populism. They will, you know, they'll still survive, but the EU will not survive under the pressure of populism. Riina, would you like to comment on this, on the question of values and how these discourses, these populist discourses, forgetful of what Europe is meant to uphold, are creeping into politics and, you know, debating circles in a way that has never happened before? How do you deal with that from your position?
Well, with difficulty, because I agree that it's happening, and it is it's behind the what has often been behind the accusations that Europe is being reactive in the light of in the face of the current crises. Europe isn't being reactive, but Europe is split by fundamental political differences because of the tendency to govern by polls, Gallup polls, not polls, and it's true that when you sit and when the leaders sit together. And they discuss for hours on end whether the word voluntary has to be attached to any kind of resettlement issue, because they cannot go home without having that word in the European Council conclusions, because they have elections coming up, or because new parties are coming up that are accusing them of betraying national values. And it's exactly what Radek has mentioned a few minutes ago. It's the this rise in populism is behind a lot of the problems, a lot of the difficulties in coming to terms with the political issues at hand. So that's why, again, a little more leadership would be welcome and would help the machine also to work better.
Who else? Ivan, would you like to say?
I do believe that, and this is really quite important, because I do believe there is a new political force which we can see in different European countries. And I can call them the threatened majorities. These are majority groups which starts to behave like a persecuted minorities. They have the feeling that basically they should have the power, but countries are not governed in the way they want. They want to prove that they are majority, strongly anti-elitist, but at the same time also strongly anti-pluralist. I do believe that President Erdogan kind of spelled it best when he said, "We are the people, who are you?" to the people protesting against him. And this is a huge problem, because this type of a wave of populism is also the wave of democratic majoritarianism. Exactly, it goes with the referenda, it goes with the fact that the majority can do what they want, it goes with the idea that the separation of power is simply constraints that makes the government worse and not better. The question is, why the people who are so mistrustful to political elites are ready to allow the populist leaders to consolidate so much power? Because this is the paradox. Europeans does not trust politicians. At the same time, they're allowing people to get a lot of power, and it could be seen in many countries, also in our part of the world. Part of the story is that many people start to see the separation of power as a kind of the way for the elites to escape from accountability for their decisions. Because what is happening with the elites these days, they're all the time explaining to people that nothing depends on them. It depends on the market, it depends on the European Union, it depends on the court. And people said, at least this popularly elected dictator, I can hold him accountable because he claims that everything depends on him. And because it's the idea of a crisis, it goes like this. I do believe it's a major challenge, because this is not the challenge of one party. This is the challenge of a kind of a totally different view of how we see politics. And from this point of view, Central and Eastern Europe is a very interesting case, because you can see countries like Poland that are successful in any sense you can talk about success, economically, politically, modernization. You go to Warsaw. I remember Warsaw in 1992, and you can see now why people vote like this. But one of the explanations is that you can see these different governments coming now in our part of the world. They have the same problem the second generation of migrants have. Because we East Europeans migrated to the West, some of them individually, some with our countries. The first generation of our leaders were the most pro-European, and they were better Europeans than the Europeans. Havels, Geremeks of this world. And then comes the second generation who said, but what really matters is our identity. And I do believe this type of a turn is quite important, because this type of a populist game is not simply the game of one party or one leader or one country. You can see it everywhere. And I'm much more afraid how this is going in a way to influence the mainstream parties than simply how successful some of these populist leaders are going to be.
Okay, yes, please, go ahead.
Gienek Smolar from Warsaw. I will follow what Ivan said, and I am very pleased that you said it, because I do not agree with those views, but actually what is happening is we've been facing in our part of Europe kind of an Iranian cultural counter-revolution. I'm using the word Iranian in a cultural sense. That means we've been in a communist freezer, and it's not about Poland, it's not about Hungary, it's about Estonia, it's about Latvia, where every and each nation refuses to accept refugees. We've been in a communist freezer when the West European countries went through the period of adaptation and acceptance of diverse cultures since the 40s and the 50s, Britain, France, other countries. We didn't. We have a situation we have to deal with politically, but the present government is actually exploiting it, when more than 50% of Poles reject acceptance of any refugees, but and more than 50% accepts the bringing back the borders. But the young ones who've so much enjoyed clubbing in Barcelona or Berlin, etc., and been living also in the West, working, studying, Erasmus, etc., 80% of 18 to 24 age group wants reintroduction of borders. This is something which someone like me, it shocks me.
Reintroduction of internal borders
Internal
inside
borders.
the EU, not
Yes.
consolidation of the
Yes.
external border.
Yes.
Yeah.
That means the problem of refugees became not just a political problem, it became a cultural problem of identity, and how do we see ourselves in the world. And for us, for our generation, for Radek, for us, the European Union was always a prospect, a future. For them, it became part of a threat.
Could you have a question, or was that a... Okay, so we'll take, there were two hands. Actually, I'll take this question here, sorry, and then we'll go towards the back.
My name's Graham Avery. I was a planner in the European Commission for the big enlargement, which brought in this country, many other countries, and was, in general, a remarkably successful project. My question concerns the future enlargement. And after all, Europe whole and free was one of the slogans that we had in the 90s. So I'd be interested in what the panel have to say to us, what they have to recommend to the European Union about the future enlargement. We're faced with a situation where we have promised membership to the Western Balkan countries, but the progress is disappointingly slow. We're engaged in a painfully ambiguous accession negotiation with Turkey, and then there are the countries of the Eastern neighborhood, and particularly Ukraine, where we ask them to be European, we ask them to adopt our regulations, but we're not ready to offer them the prize of membership. So what should the European Union do about the other members of the European family who are not yet with us?
Who would like to come in?
Well, I believe we should respect the Treaty of Rome, which says that any European country can apply to join. What's my definition of a European country? It's a country whose majority territory is in Europe. And then we should have strategic relationships with those who are close, but not quite.
Can I make a joke? Are you not giving incentive to some country to increase their European territory?
Andrey, what do you think of that? Andrey, what do you think of that?
Well, you know...
Sorry, Radek.
I didn't mean only Russia.
No, there are some other countries. Well, you know, first of all, I think that Europe is not about geography. It's not a territory between the Atlantic Ocean and the Urals. It's not even about the institutions, though institutions are, of course, very important. I think that Europe is a kind of mindset. And this is something that has always been the strongest feature of the European project. It's about the vision. It's about perception of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. So I think that definitely, if you look at it from the Ukrainian viewpoint, and if you offer a solution to all Ukrainian problems, or almost all Ukrainian problems, I would say that if the European Union could state tomorrow that if you Ukrainians do everything right, let's say January 1st, 2025, you will be members of the European Union. That would create incentives, real incentives for the Ukrainian society. That would create incentives for investors. That would put Ukraine on the same footing with Poland 25 years ago. But you will never say that. And we all know that. And in Russia, in Ukraine, in other parts of the world, they know that it's not likely to happen. So I think that if it is not doable, the only way to expand Europe and to make the European project more universal is through the system of flexible regimes, through non-binding arrangements, through a system of institutions which are not as rigid as the membership track. So you have to offer something in exchange which will be also quite valuable and important for the countries that are trying to get into Europe but cannot.
Okay. You didn't tell us about the proportion of Russian territory that if it becomes more European...
Well, I suggest, you know, we keep in mind not the territory, but the percentage of the population.
And what so there is hope. So there's hope. Radek.
I'm skeptical because, first of all, we are with Russia in common institutions already, and we should follow the track record of that. In OSCE, the most important part of the OSCE system is ODIHR, the part that supervises elections. Russia is in breach. Council of Europe, actually Russian citizens use the court system of the Council of Europe in very large numbers, which I think tells us something about their trust in the Council of Europe by comparison with their own court system. But unfortunately, Russia no longer necessarily honors the judgments of the Council of Europe. WTO, perhaps too early to say. But the essential point is that Russia has still not overcome its post-imperial trauma. Russia still sees itself as an exceptional nation. Russia, and I think President Putin has it right. You know, it's a question of proportion. The proportion of people who are liberally minded in Russia is just too small at this stage. I don't think it would be popular in Russia to put yourself in the place where we had to put ourselves when we aspired to Western institutions, which is to be as a supplicant. It was an unbelievably humiliating process to become a member of both NATO and the EU. It was worth it in the end, but it was wrenching. And I don't think the Russians are ready to go through that. Mm-hmm. And also, Europe is meant to become whole and free, which means that we wouldn't be meeting Russian autocracy halfway in terms of our values. They would have to adopt our values in this sense. Because it's not entering the European Union, I'll be brutal here, is not really a negotiation, it's a voluntary Anschluss.
That's right, yeah.
And I don't think Russia is ready for it.
I can hear this being tweeted. Riina,
can I bring I mean, Europe will be whole and free at the point where everybody who aspires to be part of the organizations get to be part of the organizations. I understand the political logic and the political reluctance within some member states to go for enlargement, but it's been possibly the most successful project that the EU has done over the years, and the transformative power is absolutely clear. As soon as the signal went out that Europe is a little bit lukewarm now on enlargement, the reforms slowed down almost perceptibly. You could see it in the Western Balkans. Certainly you could see it in Turkey. Now, these days in Turkey, there's, Turkey is considerably less interested in enlargement, in accession, than it used to be. And why is this? I think, signals are very important.
Mm-hmm. Ivan, did you want to have a word?
Yeah, just two things, because I do believe also where the borders of Europe is not so clear. I remember basically that we have been defending the external border of Europe on the border between Greece and Macedonia. And Greece is a EU member state, and Macedonia is not. So from this point of view, I do believe that very talk of enlargement in the way it has been functioning 5 or 10 years ago is not exactly what we're going to face. By the way, in the Balkans, there is a nice joke which very much summarizes the expectations of the people. What is the difference between the optimist and the pessimist when it comes to the EU enlargement? The optimists believe that Albania is going to join during the Turkish presidency. And the pessimists believe that Turkey is going to join during the Albanian presidency.
Okay, a question, please, from Steve Erlanger. Steve asked me during the coffee break, how come you got to ask a question at a previous panel? And so I absolutely... Oh, sorry, the microphone is there, Steve. You'll get it afterwards, sorry.
Well, today's and yesterday's discussion show that I don't...
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, Vigor Dasušackas. I'm the EU ambassador to Russia. I'm a Lithuanian, first of all. And that's a question, I want to direct to my Baltic and Bulgarian and Polish friends. I don't sign that Europe whole and free is a fading dream. What the last few years have demonstrated, and discussion today and yesterday have also reiterated, that the Europe whole and free is contested. we, the Baltics, Poles, Bulgarians, maybe one day Russians will also be biggest beneficiaries of Europe whole and free. My question is, as a practitioner, to my colleagues on the stage, what is our contribution to re-energize the debate, to reintroduce the confidence and trust to the Europe whole and free? Because our success depends on success of Europe whole and free. So what could the Poles, Estonians, and Bulgarians... I disagree with Ivan that we should wait and things will settle. I think we need leadership. We need leadership which would reinforce, and I would like to hear my colleagues.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And we're going to take Steve's question and maybe a third question over there, just to group some.
Thank you, Natalie. I think when we ask Europe whole and free, one has to ask, as Ivan just did, in fact, where does Europe end? I mean, is there an end state to this process? Because the fact that there isn't is confusing not only for Europeans, but for neighbors. And what does it mean to be free? Does it mean free in the sense that every population has to support the elite project that is the European Union? Or does freedom mean that populations have the right to rebel against the elitist project that is the European Union? That's what we're seeing in Britain, and we will see it elsewhere. It's not just, that Britain could pull a brick out of a relatively crumbling wall. That's scary. It's that what you see in Britain is effectively what you're seeing in America, what you're seeing elsewhere. You're seeing anger. Don't call it populism. Call it democratic. You see a lot of angry people who believe the system isn't working for them, and the people who are leading the system, including the leaders of the EU, don't actually care about them and consider them a threat rather than their constituents. So that's what I'd love to see some of you address. Thank you.
And yes, please, just behind you. Yeah, thanks. Yes, there. Yeah.
Thank you, Wojciech Przybylski. I happen to be editor-in-chief of Eurozine, which is a magazine representing some European opinion, partly. My question comes to Mr. Sikorski on basing on the 5 threats that we have heard enumerated by Ms. Kionka. How would you readdress your 2011 speech from Berlin? Would you still address the same addressee of the speech regarding these threats? And how would you perhaps rephrase it? And to Ms. Kionka,
you mean the speech about Germany's role?
Germany's role, leadership in Europe. And secondly, to Ms. Kionka, all of these foreign policy threats that you enumerated, in fact, are much dependent on the public opinion and European public opinion. How does European institutions react and may react to contributing, creating, and addressing European public opinion, not leaving it only in the hands of nation states leaders in creating and shaping European public opinion?
Okay, thank you. 3 great questions. The specific role and responsibility, perhaps, of Central and Eastern Europeans in supporting this idea of and reigniting this idea of the European dream, don't call it populists. Don't call it populism. Call it democracy. The question of the elite and the people, and this final question on Germany's role. Who would like? This is up for grabs. Who would like to come in?
Well, look, I think what drives populism, and I agree here with Ivan, that people feel a loss of control, people feel that the system is not working, is not effective, and let's remember what praises the populist dictators received in the previous, somewhat similar period in European history. It was said of Mussolini that he made trains run on time, right? Yeah. He may not be a Democrat, but he gets things done. And that's what people want, for things to get done. And what we need is to establish control over the perimeter. Part of the reason why countries are afraid of agreeing to take refugees is because of the open-ended nature of the commitment. If the problem was countable, I think you would find certain countries more generous. If we knew that it was 5,000 and no more, or 20,000 and no more, rather than this year 5,000 and next year probably 50,000. I disagree fundamentally with the notion that we've lost faith in the open of borders. The control over the outer perimeter is the sine qua non of the freedom of movement inside the territory. And it will collapse if we do not establish what every such arrangement has to have, which is control. And on Germany, I would say the following. To those who perhaps don't quite get what the gentleman is referring to, in the middle of the Eurozone crisis, I said that I would be the first Polish foreign ministry in history to say so, but I'll say it anyway, that I'm beginning to fear Germany's inactivity more than I fear German power. And that's still to some extent true, but if you read the whole paragraph, it was a call on Germany to, first of all, save the Eurozone, and secondly, to lead, but to lead through European institutions, not solo. So, for example, I would recommend to Germany that Germany withdraws itself from the Minsk process, together with France, and says to President Putin, to President Poroshenko, look, we try to be helpful, but we have Lisbon Treaty, which actually delegates the making of Europe's external policy to European institutions. And we will be in this process, of course, but as European institutions, not as member states, because this way of doing it nationally is sort of short-term effective, because President Putin is quite keen to talk to member states directly, but weakens the institutions. The result is that in the many foreign policy crises in our neighborhood, Europe is not in the lead on any one of them. Not good. So yes, we need a greater responsibility of the largest shareholder of Europe in solving European problems, but by strengthening, not weakening, European institutions.
Okay. There's the question about Central and Eastern Europeans. Did you want to get into that?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. And I want to start with one major difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe at the moment when they joined the EU. In European Union project in the West started as the failure, moral bankruptcy of nationalism. In Eastern Europe in 1989, it was a very internationalist regimes that collapsed. Don't forget it. By the way, when people talk about solidarity, solidarity was very much a common talk, basically, in the Warsaw Pact and others. So certain type of reappreciation of nationalism was very much there. So from this point of view, 1989 has two faces, and I do believe the Baltic states better than anybody knows it. It was also a kind of a nationalism, but this nationalism has a goal, integration in the European Union, because this was the way to distinguish yourself from the Soviet period. When this distinction is over, this nationalism is not disappearing, and I do believe that this second phase of 1989 is back. The best what we can do for others is to reflect honestly on the nature of our experience. By the way, Central and Eastern Europe is very different and very diverse. The Baltics is one story. Poland is another. Bulgaria and Romania is a third story, and so on. We should try to make sense of this, because otherwise we created a kind of a picture of Central and Eastern Europe as if this is the same process going everywhere. By the way, when we're saying that the same thing is the best and the worst is the same, one of them is even open borders within the European Union. Around 10% of the Bulgarian population left for the last 25 years. This is one of the reasons why we don't have a critical mass for certain type of economic, social, and political reforms. And this is true for other East European countries too. So from this point of view, our experience is much more complex, and we should really try to reflect on this, because I do believe we have been going with the shortcuts. It's normal. For example, one of the shortcuts is that the only way to be free is to be part of the European Union. Probably there is a way to be a democracy even outside of the European Union. And I'm saying this because otherwise we're becoming kind of the hostage of some of our own rhetoric. I very much agree with Radek on something important. Before, when we have been talking about open borders, exactly because the European Union was perceived as the model of the world to come, we didn't make a much difference between the openness of the internal borders and external borders. This is a new period, but this is a different conversation. And we're not talking only about people. By the way, we're talking also about ideas. We were never afraid, but now we're talking about radical Islam and how we're going to control this. We're talking about Russian propaganda full time. Basically, stopping Russian propaganda is not exactly basically open borders. And by the way, to believe that we are going to stop them on our border and they're going to open their borders to our NGOs is also kind of a nice for conversation, but it does not work like this. So from this point of view, I do believe, and this is my last point, we had a very kind of a Hollywood view of liberalism. And in my view, this is best embodied in one of the blockbusters from the 1990s. Do you remember this film, Air Force One? It's not a great art, but it's a fort, and you have the American president, and it is a situation just coming from the ancient Greek drama. This is an American president, and he should decide whom to save, his country or his family. And what he decides? He decides to save both. And I do believe that for a long period of time, this was what we have been doing. There are tragic choices to be done, and this is classical Isaiah Berlin. We are going to surrender value for value, and I do believe this is where we have been not prepared to have this debate, and this type of a Hollywood version of liberalism, I do believe, is over, and probably this is the new normal.
I'm going to ask for the microphone to come. Oh, it's there. Just before I let you, I just wanted to go into two statistics, and these are, Steve, you made me think of them, because I think your point is very real about how do you define populism and how this articulates with the question of democracy and people getting a feeling that they are having a voice. And there was a voice heard, and there was a barometer, a Eurobarometer on this, and the question was, European citizens were asked, do you feel your voice counts? My voice counts. So the number of people who agreed with this, my voice counts in Europe, was 39%. The number of people who disagreed was 54%. And 39% is more or less corresponds with the number of people who think the EU is a positive thing. But clearly there's an issue of citizens having the impression that their voice counts, and that's not just populism and right-wing far-right politics. It's the sentiment that people have that their voice counts or not. And also on the question of free movement, it was very interesting to hear that those statistics about Poland, but the wider statistic in Europe on free movement is that it is popular. Free movement within the EU. 71% of Europeans think it's an important thing for the economy. So it's an important thing, and that points to what your comment, Radek, on the importance of maybe giving the sentiment and the reality that the external borders are controlled, because people don't actually want internal borders to be blocked off. I'm sorry I was long, but please give your question.
I'm Mike Haltzel from Johns Hopkins and from Finland. Just a couple of words about the ties between the United States and Europe in the future, which you brought up a few minutes ago. President Ilves hit the nail on the head. I mean, we owe John Locke and Montesquieu a lot. We added to it. Thomas Jefferson's Virginia statute on religious liberty was path-breaking, and I would submit the Federalist Papers went further. But I think it brings up a deeper truth that we have differences, Europe and America. There are differences within Europe, obviously. But I think the average person isn't a political philosopher. The average person understands that whatever our differences, we're more like each other than we are any other part of the world. Obviously, Australia, New Zealand, you can make a case. But when that starts to get eroded by the election of whether it's Mr. Hofer in Austria or Mr. Trump in America, people start to question. They may not know much about Locke and Montesquieu, but they know anti-democratic authoritarians. That makes me worry. Incidentally, the demographic changes in America, I think that's a total red herring. I mean, people don't, as a noted politician of the last century said, think with their blood. I mean, Chinese Americans and African Americans really have the same ideas as white Americans. I mean, that's just a red herring. But what I do think is important are institutional ties to Europe, first and foremost, NATO. I think the trend lines there are good. I mean, I think we've heard today, those who went to the ships and everything. I think NATO is on the right track. I'm looking forward to the Warsaw Summit. OSCE, not well known in the United States, that the United States is one of the most active of the 57 participating states. The trend lines organizationally, not so hot. One last thing that I worry tremendously about, though, is TTIP. We haven't talked much about that. I think, you know, I have heard people say this is the EU's last chance. Maybe that's a little bit exaggerated. A successful TTIP, whatever that means, whatever the boundaries, I have read the best economists think that it could actually add 0.7% GDP per annum to the EU and 0.4 to the United States. That's a lot. That's terrific. And what are we doing? We're worried about dispute resolution mechanisms when 3,000 international treaties are in effect right now.
Okay.
I mean, that really, really worries me. So if you're talking about US, Europe, that keeps me up at night.
Did you have a question also for the
No,
panel?
it's just a
Okay.
comment.
Okay. Great. And please, over here. Thanks.
Vladimir Sokor, Jamestown Foundation, and non-resident fellow of ICDS. Radek Sikorski's remark about the desirability of the EU replacing Germany in the so-called Minsk process is the most valuable policy recommendations that I, for one, have heard in this session. But my question to the panel is of a different nature. We constantly hear the list of crises of the European Union being ticked off. Currency crisis, Euro crisis, Greek crisis, British crisis, terrorism crisis, migration crisis. That's a standard list. But there are two other major crises that are seldom, if ever, mentioned in this listing. One is the crisis of identity, which I see unfolding and deepening on three levels. The national level in each country, in most countries, the European level, and the Western level. National identity, European identity, Western identity are being subjected to heavy pressures, are eroding, and a growing number of people are becoming alarmed over this erosion and are reacting through what we sometimes call populist movements. And I think this is a wrong designation. It is a legitimate reaction following the erosion and potential loss of identity of these three levels.
Could you just specify
Those
how
of us who come from the East cling to the notion of Western identity, but Western statesmen seldom refer to Western identity. They have lost that sense. And the other major crisis that usually goes unmentioned, is the crisis of competence at the top level of statesmanship, which increases, maximizes insecurity among the citizenry of Europe. And I would like the panel to comment on these two seldom mentioned crises.
Okay. I'm sorry if I misunderstood, but could you just specify how this identity is being eroded, just in one sentence? What do you have in mind?
Well, national identity in several countries. The erosion is being exacerbated through uncontrolled migration.
Okay, I got that.
The sense of European identity, which has not replaced national identities in the traditional sense. And the awareness of a Western identity, which tends to be dissolved in a sort of global identity.
Okay. So, dilution of identity through
I think
migration.
it's an interesting point. I understand that in the beginning of the 19th century, many Americans learned that they were Americans by coming to Europe. In the United States, they would regard themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers and so on. They would come to London or Paris and they would be referred to as the Americans. I had a somewhat similar experience the other way around. I heard so many critical comments about Europe when I lived in Washington that I began to defend Europe and and strengthen the European part of one's identity, because it goes in layers. Identity is constructed from at least two ingredients: what we are and who we are not, and who our enemies are. And we do have enemies as the Western civilization. Kleptocrats, fanatics, including religious fanatics, terrorists. It's very important to mobilize identity by rising up to our enemies. And so, for example, I regret we don't make enough of operations such as the one carried out by the European Union off the Horn of Africa some years ago, when Catherine Ashton went to the operations center and gave the order for a military strike against the Somali pirates. It was successful. The incidence of piracy off the Horn of Africa dropped by 70%. Yet we didn't see the heroic pictures, such as the ones of President Obama ordering the raid on Osama bin Laden. We are not doing it. We need sources of pride by successfully dealing with our enemies. And it would strengthen, it would start building up a European identity based on success.
Riina, I'm probably going to ask you in a minute if you think that's right, if it's a question of Europe selling what it manages to accomplish, but I want to bring Ivan in on this briefly. Yeah. Please, Ivan.
I just want to say one thing, and this is that part of the rise of the identity politics is the result of the European integration process. What I had in mind, normally in the initial stage of European integration, you have economy-based politics in order to keep identity out. What we did, by the way, we constitutionalized macroeconomic policies in the way people are constitutionalizing human rights. When parties cannot compete on the economy, they're starting to compete on identity, because democratic politics is about competition. So from this point of view, this is an intended consequence of the very kind of development of the European project. But secondly, I do believe it also probably makes sense to look at what's happening in Europe, not simply from the point of view of what's happening to the EU. Because in the last 25 years, I can see 4 different big identity projects underway. One was building the post-communist Russia state identity. Huge project. Russia is a new country. It was born in 1991. Then you have the EU. Then you have a major remaking of the Turkish identity, the emergence of the post-Kemalist Turkey. And then you have dozens of new states being born out of the collapse of Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. On the rate of a state birth, I do believe Europe in the 1990s can be compared only with Africa in the 1960s. All these states should build identity, because you cannot have any type of governability without this. We were not interested in this, and I see this as a problem, and I do believe that in a certain way, reperceiving what happened outside of European integration only is one of the things to understand what we have now. And when basically Radek had to say that the Germans should leave the Minsk process, if they decided to do it, better to do it during the Munich Security Conference. Because this is going to be such a symbolic radical, meaning basically a kind of a tough speech with not much more policy consequences, so better keep it.
Yeah, I think Vlad's question about identity comes together with this. I think it's also seen as the loss is a function as well of Europe seeing itself as a postmodern construct, and identity is a kind of postmodern. It doesn't go together with the postmodernism. I think this is part of the problem. But I do agree with Radek that you have to have something to rally around, and this is why, for instance, in EU development assistance, a precondition for getting a bid in, a successful bid in, is to have you have to have a project that has the name and has the flag on there, and so it's all not only to advertise to third countries what the EU is doing, but it's also to have the pictures to rally around, so that Europeans know where the money's going, what it's all about, what the point is. And that comes back to the question that I didn't catch earlier about what the EU institutions are doing. Well, there are communication sections in each of the institutions. And in fact, the European Commission has a whole Directorate General only on on communications, which is supposed to be doing this exact sort of thing. I think the problem, though, is that it's taken almost like glovelead, because it's taken as the official sort of line, and therefore to be taken with a grain of salt by the population.
Thanks. Are there any more questions? We have a few minutes left. Are there any more questions? Or there's sorry. Okay, please over there. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Thank you. Tom Nuttall from The Economist. I've got a question about a sort of politics versus policy dilemma. Going back to one of Ivan's earlier remarks, when you said, if I understood you correctly, that if we have a crisis, it's more about national democracy rather than about what's happening in the European institutions. And so for now, the best tactic is to muddle through, at least for the next few years. But it seems to me that if we go back to the number of crises that Riina mentioned early on, almost all of them seem to demand a degree of further integration. And in many of them, we probably can't wait, perhaps with the exception of the Britain issue. In the Eurozone, there's a need for more integration to complete the banking union, possibly fiscal transfers at some point. In refugees, it's very clear, creation of a border guard, harmonization of asylum policy, and so on. It looks very difficult to muddle through in those areas. So the question is the policy logic of greater cooperation in these areas compatible with political dynamics in several member states, which seem to point in entirely the opposite direction?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Ivan, would you like?
I do believe, for me, this is the critical question, because European Union was based on policy without politics in Brussels and politics without policy on the national level, especially for the smaller member states. And now this cannot go like this anymore. My problem with populism, I very much agree with what Mr. Timmermans has said yesterday, that populism has even a refreshing effect on the national democracy on the national level, because it's realignment, it's recruitment of new elites, you are basically repoliticizing the public, and at some point this populist government are exhausting their charisma and people learn. But the problem is that on the European level it does not work like this, because you need several populist governments to block the common policies. And then basically people are going to see the European Union that does not function. So for me, the biggest problem is that if European Union said, let's have more integration, for all these populist movements, which are basically democratic majoritarianism, they are not fighting democracy, they're fighting liberalism, and for them the liberal constraints are very much on the European level. So they'll start fight European Union under the flag of democracy. It's very difficult to win this battle. So this is why when people talk about leadership, I do believe it's important, but part of the leadership is to know when to defend and when to attack. When you start to attack at the moment when the initiative is not on your side, you basically can lose a lot. So from this point of view, I do believe that we can push for much more policy-integrated policies, but this should not be sold to the public as much more integrated European Union, because the public is not ready at this moment in it. I do believe it's going to change. By the way, the public is going to learn some of its populist experience. This is good about democracy. Democracy is about self-correction. This is about getting experience. But I'm very much afraid that if we try to say, let's use this crisis in order to make Europe more integrated in a certain way, much more of a state, the backlash can be very strong. And it does not need to come from everywhere. You need at least 4 or 5 kind of points of resistance. And because of the nature of the European Union, they can block everything.
I agree that what is necessary is politically impossible. And that's why we have a problem. And we had a reflection group with the sadly departed Guido Westerwelle of EU foreign ministers, which proposed the solution, namely politicizing the federal level, the union level, by having pan-European lists to the European Parliament, so that so there would be a body of people speaking for Europe and drawing public democratic mandate from the people of Europe, and possibly also directly electing the president of the Commission. He would then have to start behaving and selling his policies, he or she, of course, as a politician. And then things perhaps would gain legitimacy, and such a person would have the mandate to get things done.
Andrey, would you like to come in on any of these aspects?
Well, just following the discussion, my conclusion would be, I wish we had your problems. Because, you know, we have to deal with much more fundamental issues. And it's like, you know, we ride a bicycle, and the bicycle doesn't work the way we would like it. And you are dealing with the, you know, Ferrari engine, which is probably it is malfunctioning, and probably at some stage the bicycle will give us some more mileage, but it doesn't mean that the bicycle is better. That's reality.
I think, do I have time for a few more questions? One here, please. And that will be the last question, because I'm going to take two of them.
Very brief.
Sorry,
You know,
Judy Dempsey.
Judy Dempsey.
Take your breath.
I've had these conversations with commissioners about this so-called lack of democracy. Why is it that, one, we don't have the confidence to go out and do town hall meetings? We've got the bureaucrats have got caught up in Brussels. It's not, I don't want to use the bureaucrat, but the commissions in the member states, they don't go out to the towns and villages and engage. This is the first thing. Secondly, and I think Steve Erlinger is right on this populism, it's such a way of exonerating us. We should engage everybody who challenges Europe and everybody who questions Europe, and we don't do this. Populists, Democrats, those, what was the word this used, whatever the word was, questioning our democracy, whatever, they should be involved in these town hall meetings. If we believe in legitimacy and democracy, we have to really push democracy into practice. We're living in cloud cuckoo land on this.
Thanks. One last question. It will really be the last question, right there.
Okay, I'm Andrey Kubilius, also from Lithuania, as ambassador to Moscow, former prime minister. And, well, maybe not a question, but simply some remark. I think that the mood is too pessimistic here. If you look into European development, from Rome Treaty till now, Europe was developing always from one crisis to another crisis, becoming more consolidated and more united. So we have now some new crises, and I would like to thank Mr. Andrey Kortunov for his quite an optimistic view. And we have some new crises which we need to look as a possibility to develop new consolidated policies. That is what is very much needed, and why we are so pessimistic when we are looking around. Let's be more optimistic.
Okay, thank you. That will round it up for questions. If you want to make one bullet point each, the town hall idea. Is this what we should now be doing?
I think it's a great idea, but it would take the kinds of commissioners who could do such a meeting, and not, you know, what I mean is that they should be politicians rather than behave like bureaucrats. But that means that we need a different way of selecting the leaders of Europe. We select them through a multilateral process, intergovernmental process, and as a result, we get with some exceptions, obviously. But on the whole, we get multilateral men or women. And then we are surprised that they are not leaders of men.
I think town hall meetings are a good idea, but I think that can be done also on a lesser level, and it's something that is done in the EU institutions. There's something called Back to School Day, where people go back to their old schools and talk about the EU and why it's you know, what the importance is, because all politics at the end of the day is local, as we all know. And I think this is also, just to pick up your question from The Economist, how to square that circle, I think, is also by explaining policies, explaining the aims in a way that is, to paraphrase Lenin, and not John Lennon, but Vladimir Lenin, it's European in content and national in form, and to make it resonate with people on the street.
Okay. Ivan.
Yeah. Listen, town hall meeting is great, but they don't work through translation. And this is the critical problem of the demos. Basically, you need the language. And Also, when we see what has changed, there is, if you go for the last 15 years over the polls, support of the EU, you're going to see a major difference between basically the Eastern Europe on one level and the Western North. In Western Europe, basically people trusted their national governments more than the European institutions. So they believed that they trust Europe to the extent that their national governments can affect European policies. In places like Bulgaria, we trusted much more European institutions than basically our national government, and the logic was we don't know what these people in Brussels are doing, but they cannot be worse than ours. And this was legitimate. The refugee crisis changed this calculation. The refugee crisis is, I don't know how good those in Brussels are, but my own are going to care about me more than them. And I do believe this is a major change and should not be underestimated. And on pessimism and optimism, probably we have been pessimistic, at least on my side, because in Bulgaria we used to say that a pessimist is a person who believes that it cannot be worse, while the optimist is sure that it could.
I'm optimistic on the language issue. The official language of the European Union is bad English.
I thought it was French. We're going to round it up there. I think one of the key comments we heard was that Europe's dream may be a little bit wavery, but there are parts of the world, and Andrey Kortunov said it, where people dream of having the problems that Europe has. So please join me in thanking, in a round of applause, the great panelists. Thank you very much.